Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Caroline Griffin, RIoT's Director of Operations, and I'm excited to be your MC for tonight's event. Welcome to RIoT 50, Examining Accessibility Through Two Lenses. During today's event, we will explore the challenges of diversity, equity, and inclusion by examining tech accessibility through two social justice lenses: tech access limited by location, race, and income, and tech access limited by physical and cognitive disabilities. Before we get started, I want to acknowledge the hard work that goes into hitting this exciting milestone. So a big thank you to my team at RIoT, all of our speakers, past and present, RIoT sponsors and partners, you can see on the screen here, and all of you in the RIoT ecosystem for making it possible to reach our 50th large format event. A few housekeeping items before we get started. Please keep your microphones muted throughout the event. This is a reminder that you may turn on closed captions and/or live transcription for the event. If you have any questions, please place those in the chat box. The RIoT team will be monitoring the chat box throughout the event and will make sure all of your questions are answered. There will be two sets of polling questions during the event. I encourage you to participate. Please note that all of your answers will remain anonymous. The best way to view tonight's presentation is in speaker view. To change your current Zoom view, please click view in the top right of Zoom and select speaker view in the drop-down menu. However, we will have a number of panelists and moderators today, so please be cognizant of that. In addition to this being RIoT's 50th large format event, this is also a very exciting event as it serves as the public kickoff between RIoT and the Diversity Movements Partnership. As we talk about accessibility tonight, I want to make you all aware of the Diversity Movement and Ablr's upcoming Disability Inclusion e-learning course. The Diversity Movement has partnered with Ablr to co-create a fully asynchronous e-learning course on disability inclusion and digital accessibility. The course's 5 modules include understanding disabilities, disability etiquette, the business case for disability inclusion, actions for making your workplace inclusive, and accessibility accommodations and adoptions. You may text preview to the number on the screen to gain exclusive early access to the first 2 modules of the course. Now, for the reason you are all here today, I'm thrilled to introduce our expert moderators and panelists joining us this evening. Moderating today's panels are Kaela Kovach-Galton, Curriculum and Project Strategic and co-founder of the Diversity Movement, Sharon Delaney McCloud, Vice President of Professional Development for Walk West and Certified Diversity Executive for the Diversity Movement, and Cobb, Director of Partnership East for RIoT. In addition to our moderators, we have 5 expert panelists here with us tonight. Tonight's panelists are Sharon Delaney McCloud, Vice President of Professional Development for Walk West and Certified Diversity Executive for the Diversity Movement, Jess George, Government and Community Affairs Manager for Google Fiber, John Samuel, co-founder and CEO of Ablr, and Matt Bauer, VP of Connected Communities Lead for the Wireless Research Center. Our first panel this evening will explore tech access limited by physical and cognitive disabilities. I would like to bring Kaela Kovach-Galton, who will moderate this panel discussion, and Sharon Delaney McCloud and John Samuel, our panelists, to the stage. And bear with me for just a minute as I take down these slides, and I will launch the first round of polling questions. All right, just 1 minute. All right, the poll questions are up. And again, these are anonymous. I really do encourage you to answer these. And without further ado, we'll give it just a couple minutes for those to vote, and then Kaela will get us started.
This is Kaela speaking. Thank you so much, Caroline. I'm seeing the poll results come in, and we'll give it a little while, then Caroline will actually share those results with you all so we can see them together.
Kaela, it might be helpful to read them out so John knows what the poll questions are.
Oh, absolutely. Yes, John.
much.
Yes. So John, the first question is, have you or your company audited your company's website for accessibility? The second question is, what percentage of websites would you guess are digitally inaccessible? And then the last question is, does your company provide accommodations for people with disabilities?
Thank you, Kaela.
Absolutely. Perfect. All right. So Caroline's closed the poll. Got some results.
Absolutely. So the first question here, have you or your company audited your company's website for accessibility? Out of everyone that voted, 14% said yes, 32% said no, and 55% said I don't know. Question, what percentage of websites would you guess are digitally inaccessible? 23% said, or excuse me, 20% from 23% of the audience, 55.4% from 32% of the audience, and then half of you guessed 97.8%. And then the third question here, does your company provide accommodations for people with disabilities? 68% said yes, 9% said no, and 27% said I don't know.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Caroline. And for those of you who said no or I don't know, that's why we're here today. And for those of you who guessed that 97.8% of websites are digitally inaccessible, you would be correct, which is why I am so excited to be joined by John Samuel and Sharon Delaney McCloud for this panel. During this discussion, we'll be taking a deep dive into what technical accessibility means to those with physical and cognitive disabilities. Sharon and John, thank you both for being here.
Thank you, Kaela.
Thanks, Kaela.
John, I'd like to go ahead and kick things off with you. I've learned a lot over the past several months working with you on TDM and Ablr's Joint Disability Inclusion course. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how Ablr came to be?
Well, thank you so much to the RIoT team and everyone who's put this together, because I'm so thankful to be speaking with you. So my journey to Ablr actually started, I guess, maybe 20 years ago when I was diagnosed with a degenerating eye condition and I was told I was going blind. And as a young person, it was devastating news. And I was embarrassed to tell people. And after I finished up college at NC State, I realized I needed to get out of North Carolina because driving was becoming a big barrier for me. And I just didn't think I could ever live in my hometown of Cary, North Carolina. And so I ended up going around the world and keeping this secret to myself, the fact that I'm going blind. And I went to India for a couple of years. I went to New York, and then I went to Africa, and then back to DC. And it was really when I got to DC and I met a lady named Liesl Riddle. She was the associate dean at George Washington University. And she encouraged me to be open about my disability and to share the fact that I was losing my sight with my classmates. And I often say that was the first time I could be my authentic self, and I was able to meet my wife. And so that was really kind of on a personal note, I started to talk about it. But professionally, I was still embarrassed, and I thought companies would see it as a liability. And so I was keeping it a secret, and I struggled to find a job. And then a serendipitous encounter allowed me to meet Jeffrey Hodding, who's the president of LCI. And who knew that 7 miles from where I grew up was the largest employer of Americans who are blind, and I could ever come back home and work here. And Jeffrey and I met, and he told me he wanted to create knowledge-based jobs for people with disabilities in tech services. And so I ended up coming on board and launching a business to just do that. And when I started looking at call centers, because that was the first line of business we thought we could enter into, we noticed that the software just wasn't accessible. And we realized that we weren't, companies can say, oh, we want to bring on people with disabilities into these roles. But if we don't set people up for success, we're not going to be doing any good for the company or the individual. Mm-hmm. And so that's when we decided we needed to take a step back and focus on digital accessibility. And that's when we launched what we called LCI Tech. And that was really focused around creating employment for individuals to become digital accessibility analysts. And I happened to be at a diversity and inclusion, at a tech conference where Donald Thompson, the CEO of Walk West, was talking about diversity and inclusion. And he was talking about it from the business case, the same way that I was seeing DEI. And he offered to meet anyone for coffee, and I jumped at the opportunity. And so when we met, he told me he never thought about people with disabilities in the context of tech or in diversity and inclusion. And he started spending a lot of time with me and coming and meeting with the team. And 18 months later, we launched Ablr, which is a joint venture between LCI and Walk West. And we're super excited about it because we're now able to really expand our offering to include not just digital accessibility, but really disability inclusion services to remove those barriers that have been hindering people with disabilities from all aspects of life.
That's amazing. Thank you, John. And I've certainly loved to follow your journey on LinkedIn as well. Sharon, I want to turn it over to you now. What has your accessibility journey looked like?
Thanks, Kaela. And I love hearing John's story. And I encourage all of you who are in attendance today to follow John on LinkedIn, Instagram. He's been really revealing a very authentic, vulnerable journey. And I think you would find it very inspiring. But I came to learn about accessibility because I met John, and it was nothing I'd ever thought about before. The only thing I think I ever really realized about accessibility was, ramps or handicap parking spots. I had never made the leap to think about digital accessibility until I met John. And it was only then that I realized, oh my goodness. And he invited me to come out to his office for a tour. He introduced me to some of his teammates, and a couple of them did a demonstration on what a screen reader does. I was blown away. And if you've never seen a screen reader in action, it's just phenomenal. And much like people who read, as children, we read very slowly. And as you get older, you read faster and faster. People who use screen readers listen quickly. It's the craziest thing. Like, they can listen to a podcast times 3, like 3 times faster than the rest of us. So that was kind of initially just scratching the surface of what digital accessibility is. And as I learned more, what was so disturbing was to see some of the statistics that I have now also gotten to really delve into as being a part of the diversity movement. The fact that 26% of adults in the United States have some form of disability. And when we look at the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and its definition of what a disability is, it could be visual, auditory, mobility, or cognitive. Now, think about that. That's a large group of people. In fact, it's the largest group of minorities per se in the United States, and I believe across the world. So here you've got this, a quarter of our population experiences or lives with some kind of disability. So that means whether you're in healthcare, banking, education, whatever it is, you may be cutting out a quarter of the population. What does that mean? If you are an organization that really strives to be diverse, equitable, and have equity and inclusion, you're not meeting the mark. If you do not have digital accessibility, if people cannot access the content on your website, because nowadays every organization has a website. That is their storefront, essentially. And in pandemic times, even more so. And so I just became really interested in learning more about this. But I have to say, it probably would not have happened at this juncture of my career had it not been for meeting John. And as he pointed out, the knowledge economy and providing workforce development and jobs for people with disabilities. I mentioned a quarter of people of the folks in the United States have a disability, but of those people, 70% remain unemployed. And it's not because they can't or want to do the work. It's because the rest of us are not giving them the chance. And so that is part of the holistic mission of Ablr. It's not just digital accessibility to make sure that your website's accessible, but it's also providing opportunity for these incredibly talented people who just need a chance.
Thank you,
Wow, Sharon,
Yes,
thank
yeah.
you. Very, very powerful. And I mean, I've been so lucky as well to learn so much from John and his team. And this is definitely an up and coming topic that I think a lot of people aren't exposed to enough. And so really grateful to be here with both of you today to talk more about it. I want to go ahead and dive into both of your areas of expertise a little bit more. So John, question for you. There's a big push for companies to become more cognizant of their online presence and how people are interacting with it. What is the most common question you get around technical accessibility?
Yeah, first, whenever I hear that, a lot of people have questions about, one, what is accessibility, right? So that's like, what, and then they'll ask me, oh, I didn't realize that people who are blind could actually use the computer or use the technology. And it's those are, after you get past those initial questions, we get into the real kind of the meat of it all. And a lot of people say, oh, people with disabilities don't visit my websites. And so I don't, they want to know, should I have my website accessible? But from a technical standpoint, there's a lot of things that people can actually do. It's not a heavy lift. There are, to really become truly accessible with the web content accessibility guidelines and be truly like compliant and usable, you really need to have a team of professionals to come in, make sure that the site is tested, and then you're actually using people with disabilities or people who use assistive technologies to go through and do that. But I think that, some of the things that people can actually do is, color contrast. One thing that we often talk about, and Sharon may go into this, is about the Silver Tsunami. The individuals are baby boomers who are turning 65 every day. It's around 10,000 people every day who are turning 65 and older. And every 7 years, they're more likely to gain a disability. Right? We often say that the disability community is the most inclusive group of people. We'll take anybody. And so, a lot of the Silver Tsunami folks, they're coming on board. And, and what we need to make sure is that when they do come on board, they're the generation with the highest group of wealth, and they're also using the internet more often to go shopping and like everybody else right now. But we need to make sure that we're using high contrast, making sure that there's enough visibility for people to be able to see and read the content that's on your website. Because you're putting the time to put up some amazing content on the websites in your digital content. Don't you want people to be able to read it and be able to comprehend and understand and all this from your website? So I think one of the first things you can do is make sure that you have that color contrast. And there's a lot of free tools that you can use, like color analyzers. There's even one developed here at NC State, which is a great one that our team uses. And you can check to see it. Is your color contrast right? And then also making sure that when you add pictures to your website, you can add in alt text, which is alternative text, which is a line of just text that describes what an image is. So as Sharon was talking about, the screen reader is a technology that I use, an assistive technology to be able to access digital content. It helps me to understand what's that image on the screen. But not only does it help with helping me make it more accessible for me, but it also helps with search engine optimization. So there's a lot of this great stuff that when you take these like accessibility best practices, it's not only going to help one group of people, it's going to help everybody.
Absolutely. Thank you, John. And because you already sort of started talking about the WCAG guidelines and all of those, how does something like the ADA play into the digital world?
Yeah, it's interesting. When the ADA was written, it was written in 1990, 3 years before the internet was widely available to the public. And so when they wrote the initial ADA, they weren't really thinking about the future of the internet and how it would become part of our daily lives. But when you think about the essence of the ADA was to remove the barriers for people of all ability, for people with disabilities in all aspects of life. Well, the internet is a big part of our everyday life. And because of that gray area of it, that's what's causing a lot of lawsuits and things coming to court, because there hasn't been a clear definition of what does the ADA require you to do. And so I think that gray area also causes complications for a lot of people. Am I supposed to be accessible? Do I need to do this? But when we look at some of the cases that have recently come up in the public, that's like Domino's, which is probably one of the most famous cases right now. because Domino's, their website wasn't, or website and mobile app weren't accessible for an individual who was blind and using assistive technology. And they took it to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court put it back to the appellate court and said, it's going to be solved here. And so, this type of things is something that we really need to be thinking about from a compliance issue. But at the end of the day, when, Sharon talked about the population of the 26%, we talk about there's 61 million adults in the US who have some sort of disability. And if we don't make sure that it's accessible for all of those individuals, we're missing out on a ton of money and not just doing the right thing, right? So.
Absolutely. Yes. Thank you, John. And Sharon, I want to get your spin on it as well. Having a hugely successful career in broadcast media, you've had a first row seat seeing how people receive their news. Now at TDM and partnering with Ablr, you get to view this from a slightly different lens. So what do you think needs to change in the media space to make it more accessible?
Absolutely, Kaela. You mentioned broadcast news. And so I spent 20 years in 6 different markets around the country. And when we would sit in our afternoon meetings, I did the 5, 6, and 11 o'clock news. And we would talk about the stories we were covering for the day. And one thing that I'm so glad that in the newsrooms I worked, I can't speak for all of them. And news I would describe as quite a bit different today than it was in the 90s and in the early 2000s. But when you work in a local city's television station, it's very different than people confuse the talking heads on the national networks. That's not news. That's talking heads and opinions. A local news, and we're not going to get into a debate about what's news and what's not news, but I will say that in our news department, our first, and this is a part of an FCC license, was to cover the community in which we serve. And that means not eliminating or ignoring parts of the population. So we were very deliberate about making sure that we were covering every different community in our market. And it didn't mean just, crime or this or that. It meant for all stories, you had to have representation from all races, ethnicities, and genders. And you really had to be much more inclusive. And it depended on the newsroom leadership. And I was very lucky to have worked for some solid news directors who made sure that we were asking those questions before we went out to do interviews. Well, are we being inclusive? And are we showing a diverse set of people? And so that translating into our work at Walk West and the diversity movement is also critically important. On your website, when you have images of people, even if you're selecting stock images, are they diverse? And now you have to really think more when we're talking about diversity in this sense here, it's not just gender and race, it's all the other things as well. It's age, it's abilities, it's showing a whole array of life. And I think that people really have to broaden their definition of what diversity is. And like I said, I got my start with it with media, but now I'm able to translate that with storytelling. And I think that we've seen, John, you can also comment on this because you shared this on LinkedIn not too long ago, where the big media companies and the big studios are trying to make sure that if you're watching a movie on Netflix and you put the closed captions on, there's also the descriptive part. So you hear a voice saying, mountain landscape, focusing on, man and woman running in the river. And then you'll hear that, so because someone with a visual impairment wants to know what's happening besides just hearing the words. They want to have a visual depiction of what that is.
And actually, Kaela, if I could hop in real quick, Sharon, as you're talking and talking about your experience in the newsroom, it kind of goes back to something that you and I talk about. And when I talk about diversity and inclusion, what it means to me in the word of belonging. And I think that this is where accessibility, we came up with an acronym called IDEA. It's IDEA, and that's the inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility. And we think that you need all 4 of those components to truly make people feel like they belong. And I think that, when I hear your story, Sharon, I think that that's what it reminds me of. And you're right. I think everybody, when we think about it, we have to expand it. And we talk about removing those barriers, but making sure that people have access no matter where they are, from an ability perspective or, from a location perspective. But no, I'm sorry. I digress, but it made me think about that. Mhm.
Absolutely. Thank you, John, for sharing. And we're already creeping up on the end of our time here. So I'm going to ask one more question and pose it to both of you. And John, I'll let you go first this time. But technology advances every day and new technologies are constantly being developed. What do you hope to see in the next 5 years that will make technology and the digital world accessible to all?
Yeah, I think this is a great one. I think the technology is going to be great. I think that we're seeing a lot of progression in technology, but I think, what's going to really solve the issue is if we can, it's something I talk about all the time, proximity builds empathy. The more that we can get people with disabilities in jobs, and then it becomes built into the foundation of our development of our products, processes, and, overall systems, that's when we're going to actually make those fundamental changes in accessibility, because it's no longer going to be like, oh, it's an add-on or a bolt-on to fix something. It's just going to be built in. So the more we can get people with disabilities in the room, a seat at the table, and all of those good things, that's when we're going to see the real change in accessibility.
Thank you, John. That's so powerful. Sharon?
I love that expression. I learned that expression from John, proximity builds empathy. And I also love very practical things. I'm watching the chat and I love that people are adding in great resources that we can all use, bring back to our businesses and our organizations so that we can really start jumping in there. I see Squarespace is adding stuff so that you can use those tips and tricks to try and make your digital properties more accessible. And we don't have to wait for 5 years, and hopefully things will continue to get better, but there are tools right here that are free. There's one that I'd love to tell you about. It's called No Caffeine, as in coffee, No Caffeine, and it's an extension on Google Chrome. And when you enact it, when looking at a website, you click on the various eye condition, and then you can use a slider to go from, from barely, acute all the way to non-acute. And so then you can see, what does someone with glaucoma, how do they see your website? And you can actually turn it on and then see it. So what does someone with retinitis pigmentosa, how do they see your website? You turn on this extension and see it. Color blindness, all the various things, macular degeneration, which is one of the most common eye diseases that people in our aging population suffer from. My mother is blind in one eye and going blind in the other with macular degeneration. So I can see how she sees a website. And that is the proximity builds empathy. You can walk in someone else's shoes for a minute to clearly understand how, or at least get an idea of how they're viewing your digital properties. And I think that will make a difference right off the bat.
Wow, Sharon, that's great. I just wrote that down. I'm definitely going to be checking that out right after this panel. Thank you so much for sharing. And Sharon and John, thank you so much for being here today with me and inspiring me. John and Sharon will be hanging around to bring it all together for us after this next panel, which Sharon will be moderating. But before that, Caroline, I will turn it back to you.
Caroline speaking. Thank you, Kaela, Sharon, and John. I will go ahead and take Kaela and John away for the time being and leave Sharon. I am going to bring our next panel, which will explore text access limited by location, race, and income. So we have Sharon already, and I would like to invite Matt Bauer and Jess George to the stage. So I will add them here for you all. Just 1 second. And while I am doing that, I am also going to launch our second round of poll questions. So you will see those pop up right now. And if you will, please give them a shot. They are anonymous. Your answers will not be shared. But those are up now. Again, I will read those out loud. The first one is, do you have access to broadband at your office or home office? That's a yes, no, or I don't know. The second one is, are you familiar with the term digital divide? That's a yes or no question. And number 3, do you believe everyone should have access to broadband? So we'll leave it open for just a couple more seconds. Again, we have Sharon, Delaney, McCloud, Jess, George, and Matthew Bauer here for our second panel of the afternoon. Leave it up for just a couple more seconds. All right. So I will share those results and then I'll read them aloud for everyone here. The first question, do you have access to broadband at your office or home office? 90% said yes, and 10% said they do not know. The second question is, are you familiar with the term digital divide? 97% said yes, which is fantastic, and 3% said no. And then the third question here, do you believe everyone should have access to broadband? 97% said yes, and a 3% did say no. So that's interesting. And I'm excited to have Sharon, Jess, and Matt talk about the digital divide and speak to those polling questions. So thank you for joining us today, Sharon, Jess, and Matthew.
Thanks very much, Caroline. And we're happy to be here, looking forward to this continued partnership between RIoT and the diversity movement and Ablr. So thanks very much. You know, we've talked about accessibility from the perspective of individuals who have varying abilities and disabilities. And now we're going to look at what it means when you don't have access to the digital world at all. So joining us are Matt Bauer, VP of Connected Communities. He is the lead there at Wireless Research Center, and Jess George, Government and Community Affairs Manager at Google Fiber. Thank you all so much for being here. You know, we just mentioned a few moments ago in our poll question about the term digital divide. I'm so glad that people have heard the term and have an understanding of it. But Matt, I'd love to know from your perspective, because this is your work day in and day out, what the term digital divide means.
Well, I guess world hunger is sort of this in the same category now. It's usually used in terms of just talking about connectivity and physical connectivity, which is one of the pillars of the digital divide. What is not talked about as much and not seen as much is the what we call adoption or affordability gap, which actually numbers wise is larger and much more diverse in terms of rural urban divide. And then the skills gap, which is the modern work skills required to do what we're doing here, to work in this environment, to know how to use the tools of the digital age, which we used to say like Word and Excel and stuff, and now it's obviously a much broader thing. But there's a lot of jobs that are much more focused on sort of what's in between here and the few feet you have to your screen than depleting jobs in other industries. So it's a huge gap, about 35%. You can kind of round off all three pillars and just say about a third of Americans, can't afford it, don't have physical access, or they're all and/ors, have the digital skills training to be able to apply for and get these higher paying jobs that exist in the digital realm, which, oh, by the way, the year before the pandemic, 7 million jobs went unfilled in the US. And while unemployment was low, this is I'll stop here, focused on the folks who are just below, at, or above the poverty line. Even if you're fairly well above the poverty line, that's still, that's tough space. So these are career paths that you don't need a 4-year or 2-year degree to enhance. So something we're very focused on.
I think that, of course, I had heard the term digital divide long before the pandemic, but I think we can all agree that the pandemic really amplified the digital divide at such an extreme level. My son goes to a Title I school here in North Carolina, and there are kids who have not come to a single day of class in this entire school year. And so now the state of North Carolina is strongly pushing summer school because there's just such a a lapse of what's happened for so many communities. Jess, this is a digital world, and broadband and internet connectivity is as important as water and electricity, obviously, especially during the pandemic. What is the economic impact of not having this?
Yeah, you've said it perfectly, Sharon. Working and learning from home this past year has made those clear commonalities between access to the internet and other essential services we've traditionally called utilities very evident. And we are all too familiar with examples like the one you just described, and the devastating impacts on students and workers who don't have access to the internet in the home. And there is like a larger economic impact that's super significant that Matt referenced. In order to compete in the United States needs better internet, period. And we need it everywhere. We need it in small towns, big cities, rural areas, everywhere in between. So according to the North Carolina Chamber of Commerce, North Carolina specifically is foregoing millions of dollars in small towns and business activity because these small areas lack adequate broadband. These small businesses rely on broadband internet, but if you don't have access to it, you're at a massive disadvantage. A 10% increase in broadband can potentially deliver 1.2 increase in GDP. So imagine the impact in our economy if we connected 163 million of Americans who don't currently have access to high-speed internet. And there's other ways too. It's broadband access increases the value of your home by up to 3%, which is true whether you live in a big city or a small town. So the impact is as acute as the way you've described it, with a child who cannot complete a grade, as well as it is when we think about our competition as a state, as a small town, or as an entire country.
Jess, I so appreciate those numbers too about North Carolina and thinking about that. You hear, and I don't know if this is true, but you hear that there's other countries around the world, and I went to Europe for work right before the pandemic, and the internet was everywhere and it was fast, like just walking through downtowns in these cities. And I mean, is it because of our sheer size of our country, just the physical limitations of getting broadband to all these places that's holding us back?
Matt, do you want to take the lead on this? I've got a lot of opinions. I have a lot of opinions about this.
Well,
I'm going off script a bit. Sorry, Caroline and Aaron.
There's a couple interesting tidbits. So the U.S. is I believe it's I'm trying to remember, it's the 36th least expensive internet country in the world. So we're way down the line in terms of affordability. And then in terms of I would call it the speed of the networks, that it's a construct, I mean, it is, I've been in the industry a long time, so I'm able to, I had a class called the history of AT&T when I was in college. So when you look at where the roots of where we came from, it was the only regulated monopoly in the history of America. AT&T, largest company in the world at the time, largest company ever in terms of size of GDP. So those are the roots of kind of where the industry came from. So it's not been, you have companies like Google that are, in there like breaking things often in a good way. But the construct of this industry is sort of, a chokehold, if you will. And so, I've started 3 telecom carriers, and I've been, so I'm there and I understand it, but the powers that be, they've gotten everything they could out of this. So the speed, the reason why is just a function of sort of market forces kind of holding that back in a way. And so I think there's a way to move that forward, and we're working on some solutions about that to kind of buy a wave. And when you go to other countries, and I travel a lot as well, it is striking how, they've kind of taken more this is the railway system, this is the bus system, this is, let's get this in place. And yeah, they're smaller, but it doesn't mean, in the downtown areas and urban settings, that should be impacted. So it is, I think it's more of probably a regulatory and market force issue than a physical issue. I've said enough. I'd like to hear what Jess.
Jess, I
Jess
know
has
you
her ideas.
haven't. Yeah, let's hear, because I know that even in this market, when we heard Google Fiber was coming to town, it was like, oh my gosh, how do I get a piece of that? And then I looked up the neighborhoods and I'm like, oh, it's only the rich zip codes. I'll never see it.
That is not true.
Hopefully not.
That is not true. That is
not true.
That is not true. I will, but that's actually a great pivot, because as Matt sort of alluded to, building out infrastructure is a huge capital intensive project, right? And so many companies have their government subsidizing that work. It's, have different government structures, different regulatory structures. But when we look at the digital divide, we see that it disproportionately impacts communities of color and rural communities. And without competition in these communities, and Matt alluded to why we may not have competition, there's just very little incentive to expand or increase internet for the existing providers. There's just very little incentive to upgrade networks for those in the greatest need. However, there are a growing number of new small ISPs. There's more support from state and federal grant programs, and there is an evolution on policy and regulation that is promoting broadband expansion, and it's started to close the digital divide in some areas. So having a really sharp equity lens on where companies construct, having some of the work that I know that the Wireless Research Center is involved with the Governor's Council and North Carolina high-speed initiatives, really important for us to be pushing our analysis on where we build and why we build there, and how competition increases speeds, decreases costs, and increases the competition, and cooperation increases good outcomes for everyone.
Okay, I appreciate that. And I see people putting stuff in the chat, and I'm glad there's some resources for us to look through. But I live in an area of Wake County that is predominantly community of color. And so we're kind of the last to get everything. And it's just, I just know my experience. Of course, I can't speak to everybody and every community around, but it's just interesting. And this is also where our schools are. And we have just dozens and dozens and dozens of kids who have no laptop and so don't attend school right now during the pandemic. Let's shift now. Matt, I know that you're working on some very specific projects related to the digital divide right now. Can you tell us a little bit about those?
Sure. The one is a statewide issue, as Jess mentioned, with the governor, the governor's team, and that is NC at high speed, and that is looking at the statewide. Well, first, also to Jess's point, looking at it through an equity lens first, and that is the starting block, if you will, and saying, okay, the power, the forces that be have had their chance to sort of fill in where they're going to fill in, and in all fairness, they're all public companies, and the large companies that do this, and they have to answer to shareholders, and so they're gonna think of it a little bit different way. Not that they don't do good things too, but it is sort of where it is, right? So now what do we do going forward? So we're thinking, instead of looking at pockets here and there, what if we take a whole system like a state to say, well, let's solve this across the whole state, and let's not just talk about connectivity. Let's talk about affordability and adoption, and let's talk about the training. And so what we're focused on is what infrastructure can be deployed quickly to deploy high speed, high performance broadband, which is for us defined as 100 and 100. So it's not future-proof, so it's future-proofed for at least a period of time until quantum computing comes, or something where we're going to need to, send something that we can't even imagine yet. And then the second is, digital hubs and centers around the state, and a virtual version of that, so we can get training, and not just training for training's sake, but getting folks paired with careers and jobs that they can go quickly. I've already got a job, or I'm underemployed, and I want to go get a 3-month certificate with Google, which has amazing array, and that will be part of what we feature as well. Is Google has certificates, Google has career pathways, they also have other digital skills, those are all sitting there and they're free today. Anybody can take them. So a lot of folks don't know about it, and so we're gonna start moving things like that. And then the FCC is, just got the bill from Congress, record amount of $3 billion is sitting at the FCC right now to be handed. It was in the New York Times today, looking at $50 subsidies for folks who can't afford current high-speed broadband and current solutions out there, which is a huge, huge shift because it has not been attached to the household before. And the Lifeline programs and these historical programs, which in the past did have some great, 100% of America got connected with phones and through the original Lifeline program. So we can do the same thing with digital high speed. And so I think, we're gonna move fast and look to, great partnerships, hopefully with companies, like Google, and look to, over the next 2 to 3 years, right the wrongs and get this level set for the citizens of North Carolina and create a model that the rest of the country can follow.
Matthew, thank you. Jess, one last question as we wrap up this panel. Is there a piece of technology or a tool that you know of, in your opinion, that could almost be like a magic bullet that could get us there faster than what we're thinking? I mean, I didn't know about that program that you just mentioned, Matt, the Lifeline, which got telephone service everywhere. But is there something like that we can see in the short term happening rather than eons from now?
I have bad news for you.
Oh.
If there is one magic bullet or one magic ingredient that could take a lot of the good work that we are seeing on the ground with nonprofits that are dedicated to bridging the digital divide and groups that are dedicated to this, it's policy change. We need good policy. So in North Carolina, we currently have state laws that stand directly in the way of competition and cooperation, that functionally limit choices for families to getting faster and more affordable internet in their homes. Specifically, I think North Carolina policymakers should dismantle these state policies that prohibit municipalities, like Wilson, North Carolina has already done successfully, and allow municipalities to model after Wilson to construct and lease their own broadband networks, own their own destiny in these rural communities that have been functionally held back by a lack of competition. These restrictions limit the expansion of critical infrastructure, which attracts capital investment to local economies, increases competition and innovation. And so furthermore, policymakers shouldn't just dismantle those, they should introduce new policies that promote the expansion of broadband networks, including those that are led by local municipalities. That to me would be transformational for our state, even more so than like a 5G magic wand that would get everybody internet like that.
So policy changes. Wow. And you're right about Wilson. It is a neat community and it's only about 35 minutes east of Raleigh. So if people haven't been over there, check it out. They've got a great little downtown, super kitschy, but you walk through there's citywide broadband. I was just down there last month and it is. So what were the powers that be just more progressive in their thinking, Jess?
I think Wilson was a testimony to the folks who didn't want to see that happening in the future and saw that potentially eating into their bottom line. And so the legislation, when it was introduced in 2011, which essentially made what Wilson did illegal in other municipalities. So unless you want to get sued and you're a municipality, you don't do that right now.
Wow. My goodness. Well, I think we could go down an entire other rabbit hole. Know that you're in government affairs. Yeah, Jess, I hope that your influence in these policy issues can help other municipalities across North Carolina, because we do have so many rural communities in such need. And Jess and Matt, we appreciate both of your insights, the good work that you're doing to try and reduce this digital divide, and thank you for your time today very much. So I'll hand it back to you, Caroline.
Thanks so much, Sharon. This is Caroline speaking. That was just great. I could listen to you all discuss that all night long. So thank you so much, Sharon, Jess, and Matthew. For our final panel of the night, I would like to introduce RIoT Zone Amber Cobb, who will bring all of our panelists and moderators back together for our last round of discussion. So I will be manually bringing Amber to the stage, as well as the John and Kaela. 1 minute, everybody. All right, Amber, are you there? She is giving me a 1 minute sign. So everyone, again, very thankful to have you all here tonight. And I would just like to echo what Jess was saying about Wilson. Great community, great broadband for sure. If you want to check us out, RIoT does have an office in downtown Wilson at the Gig East Exchange, so you can find us there. We actually have a new community lead there, and his name is Frank Dees, and I think Frank is on the line. So if you'd like to learn more about Frank, let us know. I think Amber is just experiencing some technical difficulties. So 1 minute, everyone. Again, we have Sharon, Delaney, McCloud, Jess George, Matthew Bauer, John Samuel, and Kaela with us tonight.
While we're waiting, I would just add on, so I'm in Colorado, and we have the same regulatory environment like North Carolina, and Jess is talking about, and it has changed in the last 5 years, 10 years. It's shifted, and local communities got a hold of the issue, if you will, and now county and city governments are building out infrastructure all over Colorado, and it's having a huge impact. So the pathways are there, but 25 states have these kinds of rules in place right now. So it's a significant issue. It's not just North Carolina.
Thanks, Matt, for that. And I apologize for the technical difficulties. Caroline, thank you so much. And thank you all for the open dialogue in the previous panels. I learned far more than I anticipated, and I hope our audience did too. So let's see if we can bring it all together. Matt and Jess, in a study called Mapping the Digital Divide, the Obama administration conducted a survey of low and moderate income families, and it showed that 90% of families have access to the internet in their home. But as questions got a little bit deeper, researchers learned that over 50% of those families indicated that the connection was poor or slow, and 60% said it was unreliable or often turned off. And yet still some families said the only access they had was a dial-up connection or a cell phone. With how fast technology is developing and evolving, it seems as though to grow more dependent on it, we have to have that broadband connection for things like education and employment. And we've learned that especially during COVID. How do we balance the question of access and accuracy of the connection? Matt, I'll let you kick that off.
Well, what we're talking about is the civil rights issue of our time. Without this, and you could map that to accessibility, you could map it to inner city neighborhoods, you could map it to race, to gender, it covers all of those things. And so when we talk about a macro, because it's preventing a whole significant piece of, let's just talk about America from entering the digital economy, and also the aspects of services that you can get, whether it's telehealth or education, K through 12. So the inaccuracies that exist from mapping and so on are widely known now, and basically whatever has been done in the past is being redone, and that's big part of our project in North Carolina, is to get a hold on what's really out there. But also, let's just forget about 25 and 3 or these lower speeds, because they just don't cut it. They're not reliable. DSL was great. DSL took old copper lines and got us, it accelerated the thing. But we need to now get on fixed wireless, and to get Google putting more fiber in the ground, and to get, lots of other options that are out there that are much higher speed. So it's like we need to re-up it. We need to have another DSL moment, where we went from copper lines to, a lot of folks having connectivity to the internet. We need to do that now with the infrastructure and future-proof it. So it's not just about access, it's about high performance access. So you can be on a call like this, and you're with your board, and you're, working for a company and your signal doesn't, dip out because your kids are doing their homework online. So it has to be a comprehensive, high performance, affordable, and the connectivity needs to be there. So it's those three when we're talking about this sort of connectivity issue.
I like that. The idea of future proofing is really important. Jess, what do you think?
I completely agree with Matthew in the sense that we need to push our collective agreement about how much bandwidth is actually enough. And this was referenced, but just to be explicit, the FCC guidelines defined broadband as 25 megabits download, 3 megabits upload. So with a 3 megabit upload, there's no way I'd be able to talk to you right now. And so that is the broadband definition needs to evolve. And I would also say that there are a lot of folks that want to say, oh no, we've got 100% coverage, services everywhere, but what kind of service, what is the quality of service, and what can you do with it is the right question to be asking. And so pushing our definitions about what is broadband and evolving that is really important. We would like to see at Google Fiber, we believe symmetrical speeds up and down of a minimum of 100 megabits would mean meaningful connectivity for people. But that should be the bottom of the barrel, right? That should not be the top. And that's more than most folks actually have in their home. So, and I think Matthew did this fabulous job of articulating all of the benefits. But one of the strange things is when I started with Google Fiber about 6 years ago, we were having, we have gigabit speeds because we use fiber optics, because it's glass, because it's pretty much future-proofed. And now you can have somewhere between people's, futurists speculate fiber optic cable can hold up to 100 megabits. I mean, I'm sorry, you could have up to 1,000 gigs on a single fiber optic line. So this is evolving as we move forward. But when we were launching, everyone's like, what are you going to do with a gig? You don't need a gigabit of speed. And now we're all like desperate to have gigabit of speed. So how quickly that's changed in 5 years is just something for us to think about. Google Fiber, we just introduced a 2 gig product. And it's sort of like, who needs 2 gigs? I'm so scared to ask that question. The universe is going to answer it for me, and I'm not going to like the way it happens.
No.
There's just one of the case studies we always talk about when we first launched Google Fiber was a geneticist in Provo, Utah, who in his office had to download the entire human genome, and it took him 72 hours at his office. But if he used his fiber optic network at home, it took him 30 minutes. And so massive amounts of data that can be downloaded, uploaded, and analyzed. Huge human problems can be solved directly by the people who are impacted by them in their communities. And so it's, as Matthew said, a civil rights issue, but it's also an imperative around innovation. What kind of massive problems will we solve when we put the tools directly into the hands of people who are directly impacted by the injustices and disparities of our world?
That is an amazing perspective.
Yeah.
To piggyback off of that, you all brought up Wilson earlier, and our friends at Wilson, they have that municipal-owned broadband service called Greenlight. And in conversations with them, they had shared with us a story about how some of their community wasn't taking advantage of the service. And when they dug in a little deeper, they found out that it was because of the contract. They were having to pay a monthly payment and get a credit check, but really what that community preferred was to pay in advance of the month when they knew they had it in their budget and that they could pay so that that credit check wasn't as challenging for them. So now Wilson's made this change and nearly everyone in their community is on that broadband access. So hearing that story, my takeaway was the importance of listening to that community. To Matt and Sharon, let's start with you guys. How do you better educate companies and people to think a little bit differently so that we can start to bring this change around?
You want to start,
Sharon.
Matt?
I'm happy to, but please, if you're ready.
Well, so here's the way I think of this. And it sounds to me like Wilson did a lot of listening instead of just talking they were listening.
Absolutely.
And I think that could be such a huge thing for all of us, no matter what company or organization we're working. If we're truly listening and collaborating with the communities in which we're serving, boy, could we could get to Mars and back. Oh, how about that? I mean, that's just extraordinary to me, watching the, Perseverance rover landing on Mars this week. How can we do that, but yet we can't provide broadband to a fifth grader in our own community? It's just beyond frustrating and needs to get solved. And so I think there's the couple of, as you say, Amber, I mean, they listened to their community. They decided to make a change with how those payment structures would be so that everyone could have a shot at it. Why can't we take that almost as our case study and blow it up across every community? And, gosh, I'm not someone who's running a company or a municipality, but wow, could we not look at that as our blueprint to do better?
You would think so. Matt, how about you?
Well, I'm not going to say it better than Sharon did, but I do what it highlighted. When I heard that story, we had a great call about a month and a half ago, and listened through the steps of how that story happened. And what it really highlighted was that the problem are these other, credit checks. If you go to one of the big companies, to get service, that's a factor. And taking that, and it's not listed as one of the digital divide issues, but it might have as much to do with it as maybe one of these other pillars. So when you look at these structural issues and you get creative about it, and when you're a community-based company, you do things like that, and that's why, okay, there's not everywhere, every place needs to have their community step up and build a network and run it. But boy, it sure would help a lot of places in this country. And that kind of thinking, which is very common in the wireless space, so it's like somebody was sitting there like, wait a minute, we're doing this for cell phones. Why don't we do it for internet, for the home, and I'm like, great idea. I've been building these companies for a long time. Never heard of somebody doing that for home-based service. Perfect solution to a problem that exists. So it's just an example of what happens when you get that, when things get closer to the community and solutions evolve like that. And those are things we can all learn from, because that's something that the big guys should be doing too. Why not? It helps them get more business. And so it's a great idea, and it's a great example.
John, didn't you do that in Africa?
Yeah, I've been thinking about it. I've been loving this conversation because I haven't had a chance to ever talk about my African experience in years. And it's exactly what we're talking about. I was building cell phone towers in rural parts of Cameroon. And so the government, in a way to close that digital divide, they told the operators, they said, if you want to put a cell phone tower in the urban centers where it's going to generate you a lot of money, you're going to have to put 2 in rural parts of Cameroon. And so all of a sudden, those fiber solutions we were just talking about, those were way too expensive. But once we started putting those cell phone towers, we were able to reach large swaths of land across Cameroon. And it's interesting, 3 years later, I ended up being on the investment side. And a lot of the companies I was investing in were the startups that were coming because there was now access to internet in these small towns, and people are coming up with innovative solutions. So yeah, this is the best conversation I've heard in such a long time. It's been so cool.
Let's blueprint that work you did in
example.
Cameroon and in Uganda, John. I mean, you really brought connectivity to places that, folks who don't have running water, but yet they have a cell phone that works.
Exactly. There's over 100% penetration in cell phones in Africa, and that's because there was access to that infrastructure. And I think it goes back to the infrastructure we talked about and future proofing it, right? Having those kind of Wi-Fi was a way to now get to the larger parts of land. And but this is one of the pieces of advice I'd given to the operators in Africa, where they were looking north and south for solutions, meaning they were looking to Europe and they were looking to South Africa. but it's when you start looking east and west and looking at these other emerging markets who are very innovative. When you have a lack of something, that's where innovation comes out of. And that's where we started to see how to be innovative when we started looking at parts of East Asia and looking at South America. And it helped reduce the cost, and it helped us scale.
And using that same mindset and philosophy, what we're looking at in North Carolina is there's thousands of towers that are up that are doing fairly specific things and or pretty expensive for local providers to get gear on. So if we can make that simpler and make that something where let's one time pay for an upgrade of that infrastructure and then get folks something today, right now, they can get 50/50 or 120 or something like that up and down. And then as the fiber, as Jess builds fiber out to their neighborhoods, which is going to take a little bit longer, then it catches up, and so there's ways to look at the infrastructure that's there today and borrow from that. So we're actively very focused on that piece right now.
Fantastic. Along the lines of the listening, Sharon, you had brought up this phrase earlier, maybe John did, about how proximity breeds empathy. And we had talked a little bit about it during our test run of the event. I think that's powerful, and I think it's something we need to be more cognizant of. Can you help our audience understand what you mean by that? What is proximity breeds empathy?
That's John's term, and I use it all the time because I think it really helps everyone understand and have an appreciation for people who are different than you. But that doesn't mean that you can't appreciate and learn and see things from their perspective. Right, John?
Yeah, 100%. I think it's that the more that we can learn, we can, again, going back to the listening and spending time and understanding. And once you can understand by spending time with others and seeing through you may not be able to have a full, see exactly through their eyes, but you can, you learn from their experiences. So when you're building your processes and procedures, you'll think back, oh yes, I remember, when I'm doing a webinar, reading something to John is really going to be helpful. And that's going to translate into the next presentation, moving forward, right? And so I think it's being able to spend that time with others. And I actually got that, I hid the fact that I couldn't see for 17 years. And it was only until I saw another person who was going through my own situation that I actually had empathy for myself. And it took me spending time with someone else.
John, it's amazing. And you have such a courageous story. And thank you so much for sharing it with us today. We seem to be running a little low on time, and I know there are a ton of questions in our Q&A box, so I want to get to them. But my last question for all of our panelists is, does technical accessibility have a direct correlation to broadband, broadband accessibility? So let's just go around the room and answer that out. Let's start with Sharon.
Well, I'll start with, there's the different pieces to, we think, almost everybody, and I don't know what the number is, and I'm sure one of you all or somebody in the audience would know what the number of penetration is on smartphones. And John, I know, uses a lot of the accessibility features that an iPhone offers, for example. And if you could translate that now to people's homes. And so how can we make those connections? Just like we have such great penetration with the smartphones, can we not do the same and I get it, the broadband or the laying fiber and doing all of the infrastructure piece is expensive. But I think that we are hands down the most innovative country in the world. And if we would lean on people who have creative solutions, and John says this all the time, and it's true, people who have a disability are also the best problem solvers because they have figured out how to live in the world that is not meant for them. And so why not say, okay, so how can we lean and ask a diverse group of people, how can we solve this together? And I bet we could get to solutions so much faster rather than in our own little silo at our big corporate company and not asking and not listening. Wilson's figured it out. Why can't we make the rest of us figure it out?
Very valid point. Let's throw it over to Jess. Jess, is technical accessibility and digital accessibility connected?
When you asked that question, I immediately thought of Google's mission to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful. So universal accessibility is right there in our mission statement. And in order to achieve this goal, every product and service we have to create has to work for the broadest range of people, not just benefit specific individuals or specific communities. And I feel like initiatives designed to improve the lives of people who have different abilities often help the rest of the population. So you think about curb cuts. They've been originally designed to accommodate people in wheelchairs, but they also make it easier for strollers and shopping carts and rolling luggage. So I think that exactly what Sharon's just saying is that the more accessibility we have with broadband, the more we're going to find digital curb cuts. We're going to find apps for people with vision ability issues. We're going to focus on the needs of people who are hard of hearing. We're going to improve our captioning. We're going to improve our voice dictation, many of the issues we've talked about today. And so they are clearly go hand in hand with each other, I think. And as we continue to work on these issues collaboratively in a connected way, we'll see greater opportunity for innovation.
Digital curb cut, I like that. I think we should use that a little more often.
That's very cool, Jess.
All right, how about you, John? What do you think? Is there a correlation between them?
Yeah, I think Matthew mentioned it. I think both of them are civil rights. And, accessibility for, digital accessibility for somebody with a disability, that's part of removing the barriers for people of all abilities. And I think so is access to broadband and internet. They're both civil rights that we all need. And I think there's a direct correlation.
Fantastic. Thank you, John, again. Matt, I'm assuming you're agreeing with everybody else, but you're our expert. So what do you say?
Well, I'll just take, John's situation and his story is common in terms of folks who have vision impairments. Most folks who have those were not born that way, or they weren't born not being able to see at some time in their life. They became that way. So along the way, they have college degrees, they've worked, they've done other things. And then so what you have is this whole, we did through one of my companies, we were working with Seattle Lighthouse and had this, just incredible aha around, gosh, all these folks, because that was before COVID, right? Long time before, like place-based, you have to go and work somewhere, right? And I'm like, wait a minute. So you have all these millions of people, fill in the blank, who have a big challenge in getting someplace every day, but boy, they could sit down and just go to work, right? And they have the knowledge, they have the know-how, they have the seasoning, to be able to contribute to the economy and to the betterment of their lives and lead a better life, right? And so what's the price tag on that? In terms of everybody's complaining about productivity and all this going down, and I'm like, what if we get all these people to work who aren't working or underemployed or unemployed, taking themselves out of the workforce, and then all these folks who just lost their jobs due to COVID, and they're basically, what am I going to do with my career now? Because my job's not coming back. There's a moment to kind of merge all of this. Like, you look at the ADA, it is the most impactful probably piece of legislation ever. Look at every corner, look at every entrance, look at something like that. Adapt it to include all these items as well. Maybe it does already. I don't know. I don't think it does, because then we wouldn't be having this conversation the same way. But it could be adapted to include the digital realm, and I think that would be something worthwhile.
At its time in 1990, Matt, when it was written, it was the most progressive set of laws and policy to help people of all abilities in the world. But 30 years is a long time ago, and a lot has slowed down, and there needs to be a lot of change.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So Kaela, TDM's perspective, our partner on diversity, what do you think? Is it connected? Absolutely. And I just echo everything that everyone else, our experts here, have said. And just to point out, not only does diversity and true inclusion increase, the problem solving, the innovation, but it also increases profitability, bottom line. Like it really benefits everyone. So yes, thanks to all of our panelists here with their expert opinions, but absolutely agree 100%. Fantastic. Again, thank you all for joining us today. I'm going to turn it back over to Caroline, who will ask us our audience questions. Caroline?
Thanks so much, Amber. This is Caroline speaking. Just what a great final panel. That was phenomenal. I appreciate each of you being with us tonight. Let's address some of the questions from the crowd.
My bad.
As tech fades more and more into the background with voice interfaces and augmented reality versus websites and screen interfaces, do you see this as a step forward in creating accessibility, or will this make things more difficult to use broadly? And whoever wants to answer, please.
Well, this is John. I'll hop in real quick. I think about when we think about these new technologies in terms of virtual reality, augmented reality, right now it's kind of the wild, wild west. And so if we don't start to think about accessibility guidelines now, when we haven't fully adopted everything, we're going to miss out. So it's really important that we start that now so that we think about accessibility, that when people are building, kind of going back to that foundational component, if we start building accessibility into the foundation, it'll help everybody. But I think it's important at this stage and in where we are in those sectors that we think about it. And it's going to help everyone it's going to in ways that we don't even know yet.
Agreed. And could I
go ahead, Matthew, please.
Well, this is the most antiquated thing probably in existence now compared to what we're doing.
Matt, will you describe what you were just holding up for John, please?
This keypad that I hold in my hand is quickly going the way of the dodo bird, I think. Voice, there are certain things holding voice becoming the human computer interface, but we're getting very close on those things, and it's about making it more natural and also eliminating noise in the room and the cocktail party problem and all these things. And I've been working with companies that are developing, this sort of edge of this tech. But you can easily see 5 years from now where voice will be a primary interface, keyboard will be going away, keypad will be going away. These problems are getting solved. And then in terms of AR and imagery and imaging becoming something that's data readable, same thing. There's noise issues. There's ways of processing it. It's very intensive. But these modalities are going to take over from this very limiting method we're using today. It was great. It was like DSL, right? It's great. It got us along the way, but it's very slow and it doesn't help with accessibility as much as it could. Voice is the most natural thing. That's the first thing you hear, right? First thing that was stupid. But that first moment, that you hear a voice, you hear hopefully your mother's voice or what have you. You hear your name. This is a very natural human thing. The voice, the keypad is not unnatural. You would think. And the classes I took in high school to learn how to type were not fun. They were very useful, but I think as we move towards these more natural modalities of imagery and voice, it is going to transform how the computer can be accessed, if you will.
But Matthew, I have a quick question on that. What about folks who are deaf and hard of hearing? How do we make sure that they're not left out as we talk about voice?
Well, the edge of that, and I don't want to go down this slippery slope, but I believe with the tech that's being developed that I'm seeing in the market, that in terms of being able to recognize signals and different things, and Elon Musk is better to speak to this than I am, but one of his companies is developing the brain interface, and I'm not saying let's go that direction yet, but I don't think it's going to be an exclusive way of interacting with machines, but imagery and voice. I think imagery, can help with certain disabilities. Voice can help with others, and then this experience can be blended in. So I'm seeing imagery companies that are developing this tech in the VC world as way out ahead as the voice companies are too. So I think those two together will tackle the modality issue, but that doesn't mean keyboards are going away. It just means that a lot of folks will be able to have a lot easier time through these different modalities than just entering on the keyboard.
Okay, cool.
Thanks, Matthew. Thanks, Sean. This is Caroline again. We talked a little bit about this prior, but I'm interested to hear if anyone wants to elaborate a little bit more about the difference between access and availability of broadband and the ability to pay for the costs associated with it.
Matt's tired of talking.
Well, I'm trying not to hog the mic here. I don't want to be like, oh God, that guy wouldn't shut up, Matt, shut up. So I'm gonna sit on my hands for a moment.
I'll just lean in here and say a couple of points. Number one is that when there's often like this distinction made between is internet available, or is it or should we be increasing internet adoption? And I'm gonna speak for myself right now and just say that sometimes I find it very frustrating when we emphasize internet adoption because it implies that people don't know that they need the internet. And there is no question in anyone's mind that they need access to the internet. And so I think that there's often been a bit of a paternalistic and condescending attitude around the difference between accessibility and adoption. You bring generous bandwidth to people at a price that they can afford, you will get adoption. If you don't make it complex. I love the story about Wilson listening to their residents and saying, oh, right, a contract, that feels really uncomfortable for people. Well, what if you didn't have a contract? Well, what if you didn't have a credit check? Well, what if the price was the price was the price? It wasn't the price plus 10 other things. And so making it so that it isn't an inscrutable way to, have rent-seeking behavior to continue to gain a little margin of profit. But what if it was just crystal clear and simple and evident and available? Working on that's truly in service to the customer and the community is really important and refreshing and unusual. And so more companies need to be following that. In terms of affordability, I also think that there's a lot to be said about not just transparent pricing, but about having a product that both meets the needs of people and is affordable. So there's a lot of low income products that folks have to qualify for and that are pretty low in terms of their bandwidth. And that is an area where everybody needs to improve by increasing speeds and decreasing costs. And so that's something that we're working on at Google Fiber. A lot of other internet providers are actually this past year really stepped up to the plate in terms of thinking about making sure that people can have access to the internet. It won't get cut off during COVID, helping people pay for the plan. So folks are really trying to do the right thing around this, but all of those issues are incredibly important, deeply connected. And I do think that there's going to be a trend toward more transparency and reducing the barriers to access that are built in both to the price, to the contract, and to the hidden fees.
Fantastic. Thank you. We'll do one last question because I'm interested to hear each of our panelists' thoughts and moderators' thoughts here. What would each of you recommend be the first step an organization should take to become more accessible than they are currently? More specifically, where should someone who wants to improve but answer our earlier poll questions, I don't know, start?
John, do you want to start?
Yeah, I'll start. From a digital accessibility standpoint, what I would suggest is first, having, reaching out to people on your team, because many people you may have people with disabilities on your team, and asking them for their own experiences. And again, going back to the listening to people, listen to your own employees, customers, find out what their experiences are, and asking them, how accessible is this? How usable is this? And I think once you have that, if you don't have people in your direct network that you don't know of, or people who don't disclose, then reach out to organizations who do have people with disabilities, to ask them to help make sure that it's accessible. And I think you're going to find a lot when you start asking questions and listening to people.
I'll jump in and add that I think that organizations are certainly much more open to it than they have been in the past. And whether you can point to the pretty steep increase in lawsuits against companies that are not compliant with ADA standards, or because they really truly want to be more inclusive, whatever the motivation, could be a combination of both. I think that companies are open to it. And I recently was on Clubhouse. Any cool kids in the audience on Clubhouse? Whoop, whoop. I think I have a couple of invitations if you need one. We actually did our first Clubhouse for Ablr last week. But prior to that, I attended the Clubhouse Town Hall. And for those of you who don't know what Clubhouse is, it's one of the fastest growing social apps that's an audio only app. And it would be comparable to like going to a live podcast or a live town hall where there are moderators and speakers, and audience members can raise a digital hand and ask a question and have a conversation. And whatever topic under the sun you're interested in, there's a Clubhouse for it. But what we found is it is not accessible. And here it is where, we wanted to have a Clubhouse with someone who had a visual impairment. Well, how is John supposed to get on if there's not enough color contrast on the app for him to press the button, to find the button to press it? But what was really lovely to hear was Paul, one of the founders of Clubhouse, says, bring it, email us, give us your feature requests, tell us what you want. And we want to add this. We want to get this in the queue to make it more accessible. They're officially still in beta mode, but hopefully, and we're not, once they get out of beta mode, they'll really have to be accessible. But I think that more companies are finally opening their eyes and ears to realizing just how important this is. And if they're not, point them to abler360.com and find out more.
I love this question because, to be quite transparent, a year ago, I would have been in that same I don't know crowd. Digital accessibility was completely new to me, and I had a chance to visit LCI Tech and LCI Industries and tour the place a little over a year ago. And I guess my recommendation would be to just do a little self-education, maybe audit the website yourself. I know Catherine shared earlier in the chat a link that shows what a screen reader does. And I think once you have an understanding of how that technology works, now when I look at a website, I can say, oh, that heading's not labeled correctly, or, oh, that image doesn't have alt text. Like, I'm able to pick up on these things. And by no means I'm an expert, but I can now look at PowerPoint presentations, websites, apps, and at least have some idea of, is this an accessible platform generally or not? So just taking, it doesn't take too much time to sort of pick up on some of these technologies, but, doing some self-discovery, some learning, and really investing your time to try to understand how other people are viewing these platforms.
That's a great point, Kaela. For us, at RIoT, we don't know what we don't know. So that's why we've engaged with partners like the diversity movement to help us understand what we can do better. And our goal is to be accessible and inclusive to everyone. So thank you for that, number one. But learning, I think learning and listening, that proximity is empathy. That's the best thing that you can do, is just realize where other people are coming from and adjust accordingly.
Perfect segue to the point I wanted to share, which is at Google Fiber. So just for context, we are within the broader Google umbrella, our own sort of entity. And we formed, or members of our team formed a Disability Alliance employee resource group. And it's growing rapidly. And this group of employees at Google Fiber has been focusing on accessibility and representation of both customers and employees. One significant change that they implemented this past year was for our employee resource group to sign off on all enterprise-wide product requirements prior to development. Think about how huge that is, to bring a disability lens to the table before you launch any product.
That's awesome.
And so in 2021, they're also working cross-functionally to make sure that other like external sites are more accessible. And they've already had a number of different milestones that they've accomplished. Part of what I think has been really remarkable for me as somebody who is part of different employee resource groups, but not the disability ERG, has been how I'm so intrigued and interested in joining as an ally to better understand the work that's being done by this group and having some of these barriers illuminated for me. And so there's a really structural, actionable item in what I'm suggesting, but there's also, like you said, Kaela, that personal aspect to it of, gosh, I've got a lot to learn here, and it's super important that I start seeing the world from a different perspective.
Thanks, Jess. Any last thoughts, Matt? You're the last one to close.
Well, I don't think I can be as astute as folks have been, but I will just give an example. So my last startup that I helped start, that I was involved with, you know, our web person, if you will, was a guy who had, you know, fairly extreme disabilities, and but he had a degree from Santa Clara, which is actually pumps out more engineers than Stanford does, and he was the best I've ever worked with in terms of a, you know, back-end engineer, and you know, if he had to commute in, and he wouldn't have been able to. So, and I was lucky to be referred to him by somebody we knew in common. So I would just say to be really proactive. The lesson I learned there is to be very proactive in opening the tent and hire as many folks as you can and get them in the company, you know, and now with, you know, remote work being, and especially for that kind of work, there's no excuse. I mean, you don't need to have somebody come in every day or most days to do the kind of work that we were doing together, but it was like a symphony. I've never had, and I've used him with 3 companies since then. And we still work together. And so I would just take from that personal example and just say, you know, hire as many folks as you can with disabilities, and open that tent and just do it. You know, there's nothing holding you back.
Yes, John is clapping. I would also like to clap. I love each of your remarks. I just thought this was fantastic. Again, I could keep talking about this all night with each of you. I just want to thank each of our speakers and moderators. Thank you, Sharon, Jess, Matthew, John, Kaela, and Amber. We appreciate you being here with us. I encourage you to check out Ablr's website. I posted it earlier. Also, the diversity movement, posting their website right now. Thanks to each of you for making the change and to begin with, and being with us tonight, for attending RIoT 50. I hope to see you at RIoT's next event, which we will be hosting on March 8th. It is our kickoff event to our RIoT Your Reality AR Challenge. Catherine Dupree, our marketing specialist, will post that in the chat link. Thank you, Catherine. If you have any questions regarding this event, please don't hesitate to reach out to anyone on the RIoT team. Again, just thank you all for being here. This was recorded with live transcripts, so that will be posted to RIoT's YouTube channel. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I hope you all have a great night. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.